Richard Ramirez was one of America's most infamous serial killers. His killing spree that terrorized the residents of the Los Angeles area and then the residents of the San Francisco area lasted from March 1985 to August 1985. Ramirez had been given many names by the public: the Walking Killer, the Valley Intruder, but the most commonly used term in reference to Ramirez was the Night Stalker. Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He happened to be the youngest out of 5 children. His father was prone to fits of rage that often resulted in abuse upon others. Richard began doing drugs when he was 10 years old, and when he was 12 years old, he was heavily influenced by his older cousin, Miguel, who was a U.S. Army combat veteran. Miguel would often show Richard photos of the women he had raped during the Vietnam War. In some of the photos, he posed with the severed heads of the women he had harmed. On May 4, 1973, Ramirez was present when his cousin fatally shot his wife in the face with a .38 caliber revolver. Miguel was found not guilty of his wife's murder, and his influence over Richard would continue. At age 22, Richard moved to California, which is where his murders began. On April 10, 1984, Ramirez murdered Mei Luang, who happened to be 9 years old. He had raped and beaten her before stabbing her to death and hanging her corpse from a pipe. On June 28, 1984, 79-year-old Jenny Vincow was found murdered while she was sleeping in her bed. She had been stabbed repeatedly and her throat was slashed so deeply she was almost decapitated. On March 17, 1985, his murders would turn into a killing spree. Ramirez attacked 22-year-old Maria Hernandez in her garage. He shot her in the face using a .22 caliber handgun, but she survived because the bullet ricocheted off the keys she was holding. Inside the house, her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki, ducked behind a counter when she heard the gunshot. Eventually, curiosity got the better of her and she raised her head to look. Ramirez immediately shot her in the forehead, and she died. That same night, within an hour of the previous home invasion, Ramirez pulled 30-year-old Veronica Yui out of her car and shot her twice with the same gun as the last crime and fled. She was pronounced dead on arrival to the hospital. The 2 murders in the same day, along with 1 attempted murder, gained a lot of media coverage. On March 27, 1985, Ramirez broke into a home that he had burglarized a year earlier in Whittier, California at about 2 a.m. and shot 64-year-old Vincent Charles Zazzara while he was sleeping. Vincent's wife Maxine, who was 44 years of age, was awoken by the gunshot. Ramirez then beat her and bound her hands together and demanded to know where the valuables were. While he ransacked the room, Maxine got free and grabbed her shotgun from under the bed and tried to shoot Ramirez, but it wasn't loaded. This angered Richard, who proceeded to shoot her with the same gun used at the 2 previous crimes. He then got a kitchen knife and stabbed and mutilated her corpse. He then gouged her eyes out and took them with him. Vincent and Maxine's bodies were later found by their son Peter. Ramirez left behind footprints from Avia sneakers he had on, and the bullet casings from this crime matched ones from previous crimes that he had committed. The police then knew that there was a serial killer on the loose. On May 14, 1985, Ramirez broke into the house of Bill Doy, age 66, and his disabled wife Lillian, aged 56. While Bill was in his room, Ramirez shot him in the face with a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. He then beat him into unconsciousness. He then went into Lillian's room, bound her with thumb cuffs. He then proceeded to rape her and ransack the home in search for valuables. Lillian survived the attack, but Bill died while in the hospital. On May 29, 1985, Ramirez broke into the home of Mabel Bell, aged 83, and her disabled younger sister, Florence Lang, aged 81. Ramirez grabbed a hammer and then bludgeoned and bound Lang in her bedroom. He then did the same thing to Bell before using an electrical cord to shock her. He then raped Lang and used lipstick he found to draw a satanic pentagram on Lang's inner thigh and on the walls of both their bedrooms. The women were found 2 days later. Both were rendered comatose. Mabel Bell would soon die of her injuries. The next day, Ramirez drove to Burbank, California. He then broke into the home of 42-year-old Carol Kyle. At gunpoint, he bound Carol and her 11-year-old son with handcuffs. He proceeded to ransack the house. He released Carol so she could direct him to her valuables. He then raped her repeatedly and then raped her son. He bound her again and fled. On July 2nd, 1985, he broke into the home of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon, who happened to be a widowed grandmother. While she was sleeping in her bedroom, Ramirez entered and bludgeoned her into unconsciousness with a lamp. He then got a 10-inch butcher knife from her kitchen and stabbed her to death. Just 3 days later, on July 5th, 1985, Ramirez broke into a home in Sierra Madre, California, and bludgeoned 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron. He then attempted to strangle her with a telephone cord, and he saw sparks coming from the cord. Then, when Whitney began to breathe again, he fled the scene out of fear, believing that Jesus Christ had saved her and prevented her from dying. Whitney survived, but needed 478 stitches to close the lacerations on her scalp from the attack. Of course, Ramirez continued killing more people, sometimes forcing them to swear to Satan before he would kill them. On August 24th, 1985, Ramirez went 76 miles south of Los Angeles in a stolen car. He then dropped his shoes and gun off the Golden Gate Bridge because both of those were a huge piece of evidence that pointed to all the crimes being committed by the same killer. Ramirez then proceeded to murder people in San Francisco. The police found a fingerprint on a stolen car and it matched Richard Ramirez. They finally knew who the Night Stalker was, so they released his picture to the public in the newspaper. When Ramirez returned to California, he went to the store. There were some women referring to him as El Matador, which is Spanish for the killer. Ramirez then looked down and saw his face in the newspaper and went on the run. After running for about 2 miles, he attempted to carjack a woman in a neighborhood. The people in the neighborhood came out and beat Ramirez, and the police came and arrested him. The Night Stalker had finally been caught. The trial at one point had actually been halted because one of the members of the jury was found murdered. Ramirez was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of sexual assault, and 14 counts of burglary. On September 20th, 1989, Ramirez was convicted of all charges and was sentenced to death. On June 7th, 2013, Ramirez died. He wasn't executed, though. He died of B-cell lymphoma.